The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of the small church, casting long shadows across the worn wooden pews. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and kept her eyes fixed on her folded hands. She could feel the weight of dozens of stares boring into her back, but she refused to turn around. The whispers had started the moment she walked through the church doors, just like they did every Sunday for the past 3 months. "Poor thing," she heard Mrs. Patterson say to her neighbor, though her tone carried no real sympathy. "But you know what they say about women who can't keep their babies." Margaret's jaw tightened. She wanted to stand up and scream that it wasn't her fault, that she had done everything right, that she had wanted that baby more than anything in the world. But what was the point? These people had already made up their minds about her. The pastor's voice droned on about forgiveness and God's plan, but Margaret barely heard the words. Her mind drifted back to that terrible night 3 months ago when the cramping started. She remembered Thomas rushing to get the doctor, remembered the blood, remembered the deafening silence where there should have been a baby's cry. The doctor had been kind enough, explaining that these things happen sometimes, that it was nobody's fault. But the town's older women had their own explanations. "God doesn't take babies from good mothers," her mother-in-law had whispered harshly. The day after the funeral, "There must be a reason." Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her seat as the service continued. She noticed how the other women gathered their children a little closer when she passed by, as if whatever curse they believed she carried might somehow spread to their little ones. It was ridiculous, but it hurt all the same. After the service ended, Margaret waited until most of the congregation had filed out before standing up. She had learned that it was easier this way, less chance of awkward encounters or pointed silence. But as she made her way toward the door, she nearly collided with young Betty Williams, who was carrying her newborn son. "Oh, Margaret," Betty sighed, her cheeks flushing red. "I didn't see you there." Margaret's heart clenched as she looked at the tiny bundle in Betty's arms. The baby was perfect, with pink cheeks and tiny fingers that peeked out from his blanket. For a moment she couldn't breathe. This should have been her life. She should have been the one holding a baby, showing him off to the congregation, receiving congratulations and blessings. "He's beautiful," Margaret managed to whisper. Betty clutched the baby tighter to her chest, as if protecting him from something dangerous. "Thank you," she said quickly, then hurried away without another word. Margaret stood there alone in the empty church, feeling like she had been slapped. Betty had been her friend once, before everything happened. They had been pregnant. At the same time, sharing stories about morning sickness and making plans for their children to play together. Now Betty looked at her like she was some kind of threat. The walk home felt longer than usual. Margaret kept her head down as she passed the other houses, but she could see the curtains moving in the windows. She knew they were watching her, talking about her. By the time she reached her own small house at the end of the street, her hands were shaking. Thomas was sitting at the kitchen table when she walked in, still wearing his work clothes from the night before. He looked up at her with tired eyes that seemed to hold a mixture of pity and resentment. "How was church?" he asked, though his tone suggested he didn't really want to know. "The same," Margaret replied, hanging her shawl on the hook by the door. Thomas nodded and went back to staring at his coffee cup. They used to talk for hours about everything and nothing. Now they could barely manage these short, meaningless exchanges. Margaret knew he blamed her, even if he never said it out loud. She could see it in the way he avoided touching her, the way he came home later and later each night, the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching. "I'm going to help Johnson with his fence today," Thomas said, standing up from the table. "Don't wait up for dinner." Margaret watched him walk out the door without even saying goodbye. She knew he wouldn't be working on any fence. He would be at Murphy's saloon, drinking with the other men and probably complaining about his wife who couldn't even keep a baby alive. The thought made her stomach turn. She spent the rest of the day cleaning a house that was already spotless, just to have something to do with her hands. Every surface had been scrubbed until it gleamed, every piece of clothing washed and mended. She had reorganized the pantry 3 times in the past week. Without a baby to care for, without friends to visit, without even her husband's company? The hours stretched endlessly before her dot as the sun began to set. Margaret heard a knock at her door. Her heart lifted for a moment, hoping it might be Thomas coming home early, or perhaps one of the neighbor women coming to check on her. But when she opened the door, she found her mother-in-law standing on the porch, her face set in its usual disapproving expression. "Helen," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady, "what brings you by?" "We need to talk," the older woman said, pushing past Margaret into the house without being invited. "About Thomas." Margaret closed the door and followed her mother-in-law into the sitting room. Helen settled herself in the best chair like she owned the place, which Margaret supposed she practically did. Thomas had inherited this house from his father, and Helen had never let Margaret forget it. "He's not happy," Helen said without preamble. "Any fool can see that." "Things have been difficult," Margaret admitted, perching on the edge of the sofa. "Difficult?" Helen laughed bitterly. "My boy is wasting away because of you. He can't even look at you without being reminded of what you couldn't do." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. "That's not fair. I didn't choose to lose the baby." "Didn't you?" Helen's eyes were cold and calculating. "Maybe if you had been more careful, more prayerful, more worthy of God's blessing." "Stop!" Margaret stood up, her hands clenched into fists. "Just stop!" But Helen wasn't finished. "The whole town is talking about you, about how you've cursed this family. Thomas can't even show his face at church anymore without people whispering about his barren wife." Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried enough tears over the past 3 months to last a lifetime. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. Helen leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I want you to leave. Pack your things and go stay with your cousin in Kansas. Let Thomas start over with someone who can give him what he needs." The suggestion hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Margaret stared at her mother-in-law, unable to believe what she was hearing. "You want me to abandon my husband?" "I want you to set him free," Helen replied, "before you destroy what's left of his life." After Helen left, Margaret sat alone in her kitchen as darkness fell around her. She thought about the woman's words, about the whispers at church, about the way her own husband could barely stand to be in the same room with her. Maybe Helen was right. Maybe the kindest thing she could do was simply disappear. The Tuesday morning air was crisp as Margaret walked down Main Street toward Henderson's General Store. She had been putting off this trip for days, but they were running low on flour and sugar, and she couldn't avoid it any longer. Her heart hammered in her chest as she approached the familiar wooden building with its painted sign and glass windows displaying various goods. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and Margaret noticed how the conversation between Mrs. Henderson and 2 other women immediately stopped. They turned to stare at her, their faces a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Margaret forced herself to walk toward the counter, her shopping list clutched tightly in her hand. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need some flour and sugar, please." Mrs. Henderson, a plump woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, looked at her for a long moment before shaking her head. "I'm sorry, Margaret, but I can't serve you today." Margaret blinked, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "You heard me." Mrs. Henderson's voice was firm, but Margaret caught a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. "I can't sell you anything." "But why?" Margaret's voice came out smaller than she intended. "I have money. I can pay." One of the other women, Mrs. Caldwell, stepped forward. She was heavily pregnant, her belly round and prominent beneath her dress. "It's not about money, dear. It's about what's right." Margaret looked between the 3 women, feeling like she was trapped in some kind of horrible dream. "I don't understand." "Women like you," Mrs. Henderson said, wringing her hands nervously, "you bring bad luck to expectant mothers. My own daughter is expecting her first child, and I can't risk having you around the store." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her hand reaching for the counter to steady herself. "Bad luck? You think I'm cursed?" The Lord works in mysterious ways, Mrs. Caldwell said, her hand moving protectively to her belly. And when he takes a baby away, well, there's usually a reason. Margaret's vision blurred with tears, but she refused to let them fall in front of these women. That's not how God works. That's not how any of this works, isn't it? Mrs. Henderson's voice was getting stronger, more confident. My grandmother always said that women who lose babies carry a darkness with them. It can spread to other mothers, other babies. That's superstition, Margaret whispered, but even as she said it, she could see that these women truly believed what they were saying. The fear in their eyes was real, and it was directed at her. I think you should leave, Mrs. Caldwell said, moving closer to Mrs. Henderson as if seeking protection, before you bring your troubles to the rest of us. Margaret stumbled toward the door, her legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. Behind her, she heard the women's voices rise again, no doubt discussing her reaction and confirming their beliefs about her dangerous nature. The street outside felt like a gauntlet. Margaret could see people watching her from windows and doorways, their faces cold and judgmental. She walked as quickly as she could, but her legs felt heavy, like she was moving through thick mud. When she saw her sister Lucy walking toward her with her 2 young children, Margaret's heart lifted slightly. Finally, someone who would treat her normally, but as Lucy got closer, she saw Margaret coming and quickly crossed to the other side of the street, pulling her children along with her. Margaret stopped walking and stared in disbelief as her own sister deliberately avoided her, not even offering a wave or a nod of acknowledgement. "Lucy!" Margaret called out, her voice breaking. "Lucy, please!" But Lucy kept walking, her head turned away, her children glancing back with confused expressions. Margaret stood there in the middle of the street, feeling like the ground had opened up beneath her feet. If her own sister wouldn't even look at her, what hope did she have? The walk home felt endless. Every step was a struggle, every breath an effort. By the time she reached her front door, Margaret was shaking so badly she could barely get the key to work. She stumbled inside and collapsed onto the sofa. Finally allowing the tears to come, she cried for the baby she had lost, for the husband who no longer loved her, for the community that had turned its back on her. But mostly, she cried for the woman she used to be, the woman who had friends and family and a place in the world. That woman was gone, and Margaret didn't know how to get her back. The sound of Thomas's boots on the front steps made her quickly wipe her eyes and try to compose herself. He came through the door looking tired and worn, his face bearing the same distant expression he had worn for months. "You're home early," Margaret said, though she had no idea what time it was. Thomas sat down heavily in his chair and looked at her with eyes that seemed older than his years. "We need to talk." Something in his tone made Margaret's stomach clench with fear. About what? About us. About this situation. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she remembered from their courting days when he was nervous. "I can't keep living like this." "What do you mean?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring at the floor. When he finally looked up, Margaret saw something in his eyes that terrified her more than anger or resentment. She saw pity. "I talked to my mother today," he said. "And to some of the other folks in town. They're saying things, Margaret. Ugly things." "What kind of things?" "About you. About us, about why God took our baby." His voice was barely above a whisper. "They're saying you're cursed. That anyone who stays around you will suffer the same fate." Margaret felt the world spinning around her. "And you believe them?" Thomas was silent for too long. "I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is that I can't breathe in this town. I can't work, I can't sleep, I can't even go to church without people staring at us with pity or disgust." "So, what are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe you should go visit your cousin in Kansas, just for a while, until things calm down here." Margaret stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. "You want me to leave?" "I want us both to have a chance at a normal life again," Thomas said, but he couldn't meet her eyes. "And I don't think that's possible as long as you're here." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Margaret understood what he was really saying, even if he didn't have the courage to say it directly. He wanted her gone. He wanted to start over without her, without the constant reminder of what they had lost. "I see," she said quietly. "And what about our marriage? What about the vows we made?" Thomas finally looked at her as she saw tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Margaret, I'm so sorry. But I can't do this anymore." That night, Margaret lay awake in their bed while Thomas slept on the sofa. She stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out when her life had become so completely unrecognizable. 3 months ago, she had been a respected member of the community, a beloved wife, an expectant mother. Now she was a pariah, abandoned by everyone she had ever cared about. As dawn broke through the bedroom window, Margaret made her decision. She would leave Cedar Falls. She would go to Kansas and try to start over, try to find some semblance of the life she had lost. Because staying meant facing this rejection and isolation every day for the rest of her life, and she simply didn't have the strength for that anymore. The train station platform was nearly empty in the early morning light. Margaret sat on the wooden bench, her single worn suitcase beside her, watching the steam rise from the tracks in the distance. She had packed everything she owned in that one small case, which wasn't much after selling most of her belongings to pay for the train ticket. The few dollars left in her purse would have to last until she reached her cousin's house in Kansas. Her hands trembled as she clutched the letter from her cousin Ruth, who had agreed to let her stay for a while. Ruth had been kind in her response, but Margaret could read between the lines. This was charity, not a warm welcome. Ruth barely knew her, and Margaret would be nothing more than an extra mouth to feed in a household that was already struggling. The ticket agent, a thin man with spectacles, had been polite but distant when she bought her ticket. Word traveled fast in small towns, and Margaret was certain he knew exactly why she was leaving. She could see it in the way he avoided her eyes, the way he handled her money like it might contaminate him. "Train's running about 2 hours late," he called out to her from his window. "Bridge washed out about 50 miles east. Should be fixed by afternoon." Margaret nodded and settled back on the bench. 2 more hours in this place, 2 more hours of feeling like an unwanted stranger in the town where she had lived her entire life. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried to make herself invisible. The sound of boots on the platform made her look up. A tall man was walking toward her, his weathered face shadowed by a worn cowboy hat. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who spent most of his time outdoors, and Margaret noticed the way his clothes were clean but well used, practical rather than fancy. "Excuse me, miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat politely. "I couldn't help but overhear the ticket agent. Are you traveling to Kansas?" Margaret hesitated, unsure why a stranger would want to know her destination. "Yes, I am." "Name's Jake Morrison," he said, extending his hand. "I've got a ranch about 30 miles outside of Topeka. Been visiting my sister here in town." Margaret shook his hand briefly, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work and honest living. "Margaret," she said simply, not offering her last name. "Pleasure to meet you, Margaret." Jake's voice was gentle, with a slight drawl that suggested he hadn't always lived in Kansas. "I was wondering if you might be traveling alone." Margaret stiffened, suddenly wary. She had heard stories about men who preyed on women traveling without protection. "Why do you ask?" Jake seemed to sense her discomfort and took a step back, giving her more space. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to alarm you. It's just that the territory between here and Kansas can be rough for a woman traveling alone. I thought maybe you'd appreciate having someone to keep an eye out for you on the journey." There was something in his manner that made Margaret believe he was being genuine. His eyes were kind, and he stood at a respectful distance, not trying to intimidate or crowd her. Still, she had learned to be cautious. "That's very kind of you, but I'm sure I'll be fine." Jake nodded, accepting her response without argument. "Of course, I just wanted to offer." He started to turn away, then paused. I've been making this trip for 5 years now, visiting my sister. The conductors and I are old friends. If you need anything during the journey, just let me know." Before Margaret could respond, the ticket agent called out again. "Looks like it's going to be longer than I thought. Bridge is in worse shape than they first reported. Could be evening before we get a train through." Margaret's heart sank. She had been so focused on leaving, on getting away from the whispers and stares, that she hadn't considered what she would do if the train was delayed. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to for help. Jake must have seen the distress on her face because he approached her again, this time even more carefully. "Miss Margaret, I hope you don't mind me saying, but you look like you could use a friendly face right about now." Margaret looked up at him, and for the first time in months, she saw genuine kindness in someone's eyes. No judgment, no pity, just simple human compassion. It was so unexpected that she felt tears threatening to spill over. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pressing her handkerchief to her eyes. "I'm not usually so." "No need to apologize," Jake said gently. "We all have days that test us more than others." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the empty tracks stretch into the distance. Margaret found herself stealing glances at this stranger, who had shown her more kindness in 10 minutes than her own community had in months. "Are you running from something?" Jake asked quietly. "Or running to something?" The question was direct but not intrusive, and Margaret found herself wanting to answer honestly. "Both, I suppose, or maybe neither. I'm not sure anymore." Jake nodded as if he understood. "I did some running myself, years ago, after my wife died. Thought if I could just get far enough away, the pain might not follow me. Did it work? For a while. But eventually, I realized I wasn't running from the pain. I was running from the memories, the good ones along with the bad. And when you do that, you end up running from yourself." Margaret looked at him with new interest. Here was someone who had faced loss and somehow found a way to keep living. "What made you stop running?" "I found something worth staying for. A piece of land that needed caring for, animals that depended on me. Purpose, I suppose you could call it." Jake adjusted his hat and looked out at the horizon. "Sometimes home isn't where you came from. Sometimes it's where you're needed." The words hit Margaret in a way she hadn't expected. She had been thinking of her journey to Kansas as an ending, a retreat from the life she had known. "But maybe it could be a beginning instead. Your ranch," she said hesitantly. "Is it very isolated?" "It's peaceful," Jake replied. "Quiet, the nearest neighbor is about 5 miles away, but they're good people. The kind who judge you by your actions, not your past." Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone clinging to false promises, but the steady hope of someone who had been offered a real possibility. "The thing is," Jake continued, "I could use some help around the place. I've been trying to manage everything myself since my housekeeper moved to be closer to her grandchildren. Nothing improper, you understand. There's a separate cabin for hired help, completely private." Margaret stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You're offering me work?" "I'm offering you a choice," Jake said simply. "You can continue on to Kansas and whatever's waiting for you there, or you can stop running and see what might be possible in a place where nobody knows your story but you." The train whistle sounded in the distance, and Margaret could see the black smoke rising above the trees. The bridge had been repaired faster than expected, and soon she would have to make her decision. She looked at Jake Morrison, this stranger, who had appeared in their darkest hour like some kind of answered prayer. There was something about him that made her feel safe, something that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she could start over. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, and for the first time in months, Margaret smiled. The wagon ride to Jake's ranch took them through rolling hills covered in tall grass that swayed in the afternoon breeze. Margaret sat beside Jake on the wooden seat, her suitcase secured in the back, watching the landscape change from the familiar farmland around Cedar Falls to something wilder and more open. The silence between them was comfortable, not awkward like the silences she had grown used to with Thomas. "There she is," Jake said, pointing ahead to where a cluster of buildings sat nestled in a valley. "Home sweet home," Margaret could see. A modest 2-story house with a wraparound porch, a large red barn, and several smaller outbuildings scattered around the property. Cattle grazed in the fenced pastures, and she could hear the distant sound of chickens clucking in their coop. It looked peaceful, like something from a painting. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. Jake's face lit up with pride. "My father started this place with nothing but a dream and a strong back. I've been trying to keep it going since he passed, but I'll be honest with you, Margaret. It's been a struggle. As they pulled up to the house, Margaret noticed the peeling paint. On the shutters, the loose boards on the porch steps, the weeds growing wild in what had once been a flower garden. The place had good bones, but it needed the care that came from having enough hands to tend it properly. Jake helped her down from the wagon and carried her suitcase to a small cabin about 50 yards from the main house. "This is where you'll stay," he said, opening the door to reveal a simple but clean space with a bed, a small table, and a wood-burning stove. "It's not much, but it's private and comfortable." Margaret stepped inside and looked around. The cabin was small, but it felt more like home than the house she had shared with Thomas in those final months. There was something hopeful about it, something that suggested new beginnings were possible. "It's perfect," she said, setting her suitcase on the bed. "What would you like me to do first?" Jake smiled, and Margaret noticed how it transformed his weathered face. "Well, I was thinking we could start with some coffee and a proper meal. I'm afraid my cooking skills are pretty limited, and I suspect you might be hungry after the journey." Margaret realized she was indeed hungry. She hadn't eaten since early morning, too nervous about leaving to think about food. "I'd be happy to cook something. It's been a while since I've had a proper kitchen to work in." They walked to the main house together, and Margaret was struck by how different it felt from the house she had just left, where Thomas's house had felt cold and filled with unspoken resentment. Jake's home felt warm and lived in. There were books scattered on tables, worn quilts draped over chairs, and photographs of family members on the mantelpiece. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, though Margaret could see it hadn't been used for much beyond basic cooking. She rolled up her sleeves and began exploring the pantry, finding flour, eggs, and some preserved meat. "When did you say your housekeeper left?" she asked, already planning a simple but hearty meal. "About 3 months ago," Jake replied, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. "Her daughter had a baby, and she wanted to help with the grandchildren. I couldn't argue with that." Margaret began mixing batter for biscuits, her hands moving with practiced ease. 3 months is a long time to manage everything alone." "It is," Jake admitted. "I've been focusing on the cattle and the essential repairs, but the house has been neglected. I'm not much for domestic work, I'm afraid." As Margaret worked, she found herself relaxing for the first time in months. There was something soothing about the familiar rhythm of cooking, the satisfaction of creating something nourishing from simple ingredients. She could hear Jake moving around behind her, probably tidying up, and the sound was companionable rather than intrusive. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said as she slid the biscuits into the oven. Margaret tensed slightly. "Of course." "What really happened back there? In your town, I mean." "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but I've seen that look before. The look of someone who's been hurt by people who should have protected them." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, stirring the meat in the pan. She had been dreading this conversation, but something about Jake's gentle tone made her want to be honest. "I lost a baby," she said quietly, 3 months ago, and somehow the whole town decided it was my fault." Jake was silent, but she could feel his attention, his understanding. It encouraged her to continue. "They said I was cursed, that God had taken my baby because I wasn't worthy of being a mother. They said I was dangerous to other pregnant women, that my presence would bring them bad luck." Her voice cracked slightly. "Even my own sister crossed the street to avoid me." "I'm sorry," Jake said, and the simple words carried more weight than all the elaborate condolences she had received after the funeral. "That must have been incredibly painful. My husband couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the stares, the way people looked at us with pity or disgust. So he asked me to leave. Sighed, maybe things would be better if I went away for a while." Margaret turned to face Jake, expecting to see the same uncomfortable expression she had grown used to whenever she mentioned her loss. Instead, she saw genuine compassion and something else she couldn't quite identify. "People can be cruel when they're afraid," Jake said. "They look for someone to blame when bad things happen because it makes them feel like they have some control over their own lives. You don't think I'm cursed?" Jake stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his cattle grazing peacefully in the pasture. I think you're a woman who's been through something terrible and deserves a chance to heal. I think you're brave for leaving everything you knew to start over. And I think anyone who would turn their back on someone in pain is the one with the problem, not you. The biscuits were ready, and Margaret pulled them from the oven, golden and fragrant. She served them with the meat and some preserves Jake had in his pantry, and they sat down to eat together. "This is the best meal I've had in months," Jake said after his first bite. "I'd forgotten what real cooking tastes like." Margaret smiled, feeling a warmth she had almost forgotten existed. "I'm glad you like it. I've always enjoyed cooking, but I haven't had much appetite lately." They ate in comfortable silence, and Margaret found herself studying Jake's face. He was probably in his early 30s, with laugh lines around his eyes and the kind of deep tan that came from years of working outdoors. His hands were calloused but gentle, and he had a way of moving that spoke of quiet confidence. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. "What needs to be done?" Jake's eyes lit up as he began describing the daily routine, the seasonal work, the challenges and rewards of ranch life. Margaret found herself genuinely interested, asking questions about the cattle, the land, the neighboring families. "The Williamses live about 5 miles east," Jake said. "Good people. They've helped me out more than once when I was short-handed. And there's old Pete who lives in the cabin up on the hill. He's been on this land longer than anyone, knows every inch of it." As the evening wore on, Margaret realized she felt more at ease than she had in months. Here was a man who spoke to her like she was a person worth knowing, not a problem to be solved or a burden to be carried. When she finally returned to her cabin that night, Margaret lay in her small bed and listened to the sounds of the prairie. For the first time since losing her baby, she felt like she might have found a place where she could begin to heal. The autumn sun was setting behind the distant hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Margaret sat on the porch of the main house, mending one of Jake's work shirts while he finished the evening chores. 6 months had passed since she first arrived at the ranch, and the place had transformed under her care. The flower garden bloomed with late-season roses, the house gleamed with fresh paint, and meals were served on a table set with proper linens. More importantly, Margaret had transformed too. The hollow look in her eyes had been replaced with something warmer, more alive. She had gained back the weight she had lost during those dark months in Cedar Falls, and her laugh could be heard regularly around the ranch. The neighbors had come to know her as Jake's capable partner, not as the broken woman who had fled her old life. Jake emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants as he walked toward the house. Margaret watched him approach, noting the way his shoulders had relaxed over the months, how he smiled more easily now. Having someone to share the work and the meals had changed him too. "All done for the day," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "The cattle are settled, and I fixed that loose board in the barn loft." "Good," Margaret said, setting down her mending. "Dinner will be ready in about an hour. I made that beef stew you like." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. This had become their evening ritual, these quiet moments on the porch after the day's work was done. Margaret treasured these times when the world felt peaceful and full of possibility. "Margaret," Jake said softly, "can I tell you something?" She looked at him, noting the serious tone in his voice. "Of course." Jake was quiet for a moment, as if gathering his courage. "I've been thinking about this for weeks now, and I need to say it out loud. When you first came here, I thought I was doing you a favor, giving you a place to heal, a chance to start over." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. Was he going to tell her it was time to move on? That she had overstayed her welcome? "But somewhere along the way," Jake continued, "I realized you were doing me the favor. This place, this life, it all feels complete now in a way it never did before." Margaret's hand stilled on the mending in her lap. "Jake, what are you saying?" He turned to face her fully, his eyes serious but gentle. "I'm saying that I don't want you to think of this as temporary anymore. I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, and I hope maybe you might feel the same way about me." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Margaret felt her heart racing, not with fear, but with a kind of joy she had thought was lost to her forever. "I do," she whispered. "I do feel the same way." Jake reached for her hand, and Margaret marveled at how right it felt when their fingers intertwined. "I know you've been hurt before. I know you've lost so much. But I want you to know that whatever happens, you have a home here. With me." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of happiness, not sorrow. "I never thought I'd feel this way again. After everything that happened, I thought I was broken beyond repair." "You're not broken," Jake said firmly. "You're strong and brave and kind. You brought life back to this place, and you brought life back to me." They sat there holding hands as the darkness deepened around them, both of them processing the magnitude of what had just been said. Margaret thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, desperate and alone on a train platform. She could barely recognize herself in that person now. "There's something else," Jake said, his voice slightly nervous. "I know it might be too soon, but I can't help thinking about the future, about what we could build together." Margaret squeezed his hand encouragingly. "Tell me." "I want to marry you," Jake said simply. "I want to wake up in the same house as you every morning for the rest of my life. I want to work beside you and eat meals with you and grow old with you." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The idea of marriage, of commitment, still carried echoes of her painful past. But when she looked at Jake, she saw none of the resentment or distance that had marked her first marriage. She saw only love and respect and the promise of a partnership, built on mutual understanding. "I want that too," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears on her cheeks. "I want to build a life with you." Jake stood up and pulled her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her in a gentle embrace. Margaret melted into his warmth, feeling safe and cherished in a way she had never experienced before. "We don't have to rush," Jake murmured against her. "Hair, we can take all the time you need." "I don't need time," Margaret replied. "I've already found what I was looking for." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony in the nearby town. The local pastor, a kind man named Reverend Collins, performed the service in his small church. Jake's sister came from Cedar Falls, along with a few neighbors from the surrounding ranches. Margaret wore a simple blue dress that Jake had bought for her, and she carried wildflowers from their own garden. What struck Margaret most about the ceremony was how different it felt from her first wedding. There was no anxiety, no sense of performing for others. Instead, there was joy and certainty and the quiet confidence that came from knowing she was making the right choice. The neighbors who attended were warm and welcoming, treating Margaret as one of their own. Mrs. Williams, the wife of their nearest neighbor, hugged her tightly after the ceremony and whispered, "We're so happy Jake found you. You're perfect for each other." That evening, as they sat on their porch as husband and wife, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the baby she had lost, and while the grief would always be part of her, it no longer defined her. She had learned that healing didn't mean forgetting, but rather finding a way to carry the pain while still being open to joy. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that train hadn't been delayed?" Margaret asked, leaning against Jake's shoulder. Jake chuckled softly. "I think we would have found each other somehow. Some things are just meant to be." Margaret smiled, looking out at the land that had become her home, at the man who had become her partner in every sense of the word. She had come to this place broken and alone, but she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. She had found a love that was built on respect and understanding, a home that was created through shared work and dreams, and a future that stretched out before them full of possibility. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too," Jake replied. "Welcome home, Mrs. Morrison." And for the first time in her life, Margaret truly understood what home meant. It wasn't a place or a building or even the town where you were born. Home was where you were valued and cherished, where you could be yourself without fear of judgment. Home was where you belonged.